Right, well, here we are. This is my third attempt at making this video. And the last one was a really long one, where there was no audio. So much for that. I'll go this way, just for a little bit of extra fun. My last attempt was one where the audio failed. So we'll see what we can do this time. The subject was on government, authoritarianism, libertarianism, and what the Christian perspective is on government. I know this is a very sensitive subject for many people, especially back in Finland, where I was for 3 years and a half, almost the better part of 4 years, from July 2015 through April 2019, and July 17th, 2015 through April 17th, 2019. And the reason is because people in Finland have a different attitude toward government than people where I grew up in central Ohio. The attitude of Finns is considerably more similar to the attitude of people near areas of large population, a high population density, in the coastal cities, and Chicago and so on, in the United States, as opposed to the Midwest, which is where I come from. And so I'll go this way. So I have different views on government than many of you who hail from different areas. And many of these issues on government are issues of contention due to the fact that people believe the government should be doing something different, and so they choose to read the Bible in certain ways that confirm their own biases. So that's interesting, to say the very least. I'll attempt to let you know what my biases are when they come into play here, as I don't think it would be fair for you to not get an appropriate look at the Christian view without it being tainted by some guy from the Midwest. But yet there are parts of my view that seem to be predicated upon an understanding of the role of government. So anyhow, if you'll bear with me, we'll try to get through this challenge together. This person here is being a poop head. This person here was going to try to pass me in a 25-mile-an-hour zone when I was doing 25 miles an hour. So, but anyhow, going back to the role of government, I am amongst those that believe the role of government is small. I believe government plays a small but important role in the life of citizens, and should play a small but important role in the life of citizens. And I think that anything in excess of that is a misuse of governmental power. And notice I make a distinction between power and authority. I make a big distinction between power and authority because there is a difference. If I have the power to do something, it doesn't mean that I have the authority to do something. And if you have the power to do something, that doesn't mean that you have the authority to do something. The power to do something and the right to do something are two completely different things that I dare say Nietzsche would disagree with. Nietzsche would essentially say that, well, power is all there is, and so we should be all following our will to power and trying to become the Superman, and that's that. And if we can control the government, so much the better, right? Except he's not going to say that because he thinks that communism is a horrible evil. Which is interesting that his philosophy was distorted and quoted as an attempt to provide some sort of justification for National Socialism in Germany in the 1930s, but that's a completely different question. Anyhow, the basic idea is that my understanding of authority and power and things of that nature is very different than the understanding that many people have nowadays of authority and power, because I believe that it's considerably more limited than do many people that inhabit large population centers and think certain things about the way that things need to be run in places where people are very close together. And I also think that big places need to be run differently than small places, and places where people are very close together need to be run differently than places where people have more space. Mostly to prevent people from infringing upon the rights of others, and that it's easier to infringe upon the rights of other people in large population centers, and so paradoxically it actually results in people needing to give up more of their own personal liberties in order to not infringe upon other people's personal liberties. The issue that I have is when these matters get somewhat, shall we say, distorted maybe, or when people paint with too broad a brush, thinking that somehow policies that work in New York City should be implemented in Columbus, Ohio. I think that that's a very foolhardy way to go, and that leads to the question, what is the actual role of government? And they'll say, oh, well, it's to make fiscal and social policy. Oh, it's to do this. Oh, it's to do that. And, well, if you take the Christian view of government, and I'm not going to say the left Christian or the right Christian or any of these, I'm saying that if you actually take the Bible and understand it as it has been understood by Christians for thousands of years, the role of the government is to wield the sword. That is it. And that allows, at least for many of us who believe that, to have at least a very interesting opinion on what the role of government is. And my opinion is quite simple. It's that if I don't think someone should be allowed to do something with a sword, I don't think the government should be in that line of business. I think that it is the domain of the government to do things that I myself should be allowed to do with a sword. So that means stop someone from stealing my stuff. Yes, I think the government should be allowed to do that with their sword. Stop someone from killing someone else. Yes, I think the government should be allowed to do that with their sword. Build a library. fair use of government. Force everyone to educate their children the same way. Now, this is completely different than not allowing people to abuse their children. Going after child abusers, yes. Going after people that teach their children wrong things, that's a little bit, depending upon how bad it is. Yes or no. Going after people who teach their children to be Nazis. Yeah, that's good. Going after people who teach their children to be socialists. Well, that's not quite so common, but I would say, yeah, that's a good idea. You don't want people to go and become murderous, psychopathic dictators. Or the dumb sheep that let that happen, but forcing a particular curriculum or forcing people to spend 6 to 8 hours of their day in a place, I don't know if compulsory education should be the role of the government. And think, okay, how about enforcing whether or not a fence is painted white or black? Someone else's fence, not my fence, but someone else's fence. I don't know. I don't think so. And so you just keep on going through all these different domains and thinking, well, should I be allowed to use a sword to do this? Should I be allowed to use a sword to go and change the color of my neighbor's fence? No. So the government shouldn't be allowed to do that. Should I be allowed to use a sword to build a road? I don't know. Maybe not. Of course, those are things that governments have done for a very long time, and so maybe someone should be allowed to use a sword to build a road. I don't know, but that doesn't strike me as the best of uses, though I might consent to... I might concede the point, or at least concede the point for the sake of this conversation, so we don't go up that particular bunny trail any further. But ultimately, this boils down to being a Fourth Commandment issue. And by the Fourth Commandment, I mean what Catholics and Lutherans and people that use that particular parsing of the commandments would call the Fourth Commandment, which is honor your father and your mother, which Luther in his catechism says means we should fear and love God so that we do not despise or anger our parents or other authorities, but honor them, serve and obey them, love and cherish them. So you honor people that are filling the role of either parent or sword bearer. You serve and obey them. Hopefully only insofar as their role actually warrants it. Obviously, if you have somebody bearing the sword on your behalf, you want to maybe serve them their food and listen to them when they tell you something that's associated with your safety or the safety of your brothers or sisters or the safety of your community. You would listen to them, assuming they, are in a role like that. Love and cherish them. You understand that they are actually doing an important job, and without them, a lot of, we would potentially be overrun as a country if we're talking about our government. So you love and cherish them. However flawed they may be, you go and you still look and say, okay, maybe these people are abusing their power, but the authority given to go and do good things is still not a bad authority. So that's part of it. That's certainly a part of it. It's like, okay, what's the role of then parents? Parents don't wield the sword, but so the family is different. The family is different than government. The family exists for the purpose of procreation and for the purpose of providence. So you provide, you make more human beings, and you provide for the human beings that already exist in your family, and that's how family is designed to work. Now, maybe the sword gets associated there with a bit if Say I were a bad dad and I went out drinking and I drank away my paycheck and I didn't take care of my children. Well, maybe somebody should be allowed to use a sword to prevent me from doing that, to prevent me from abusing my children. Okay, but it's a very, very different role, that of family member, that of father or mother. Because fathers and mothers, we're specifically here for our children. And I'd like to think that my wife and I are good ones, or good parents. I'd like to think that. I might be deluding myself if I think that, but I'd like to think that, and I definitely do what I do out of love for my family. And so that means that when I go and I tell my children, don't climb that shelf, I should be obeyed. And when I tell my children, don't throw a fit in the restaurant, I should be obeyed. Yes, I have good reasons. The reason is so they don't fall and hurt their head or hit themselves or need to go to the hospital or what have you if they climb the shelf, or that people don't hate them and that they don't turn into miserable, wretched human beings that don't know how to function in the world and throw fits. Okay, so that's two examples, right? But there's the reason that obedience is what is due a parent. It's because we are there for the service of the children. And then later in life, the children are there in service of us. That's at least how it's worked for many millennia. You know, the idea of having a social security net only exists because people have gone and ultimately taken the role that was originally allocated to family and given it to government instead. And the case can be made, well, what happens if government does it better, or government is more trustworthy than parents? And then I would say, well, something seriously needs to change within the family then. But I trust my family. I hope that I'm trustworthy according to them. My family has been there for me in many ways, and I'm there for them. And that's just the way it's always been. And so parents should be loved and cherished for following their consciences and providing and protecting for their children. Then there's this question of, okay, what do you do if a parent abuses the authority? Like government, you really can't do too much because they're so powerful that you have certain channels that you go through, and that's about it. Right, and it's very nice in the United States because there's actually a whole lot more ability for any given citizen to have an impact on how they're governed than in many of the less free areas of the world. And so I would say that if there's an abuse of power in the government, then it's the duty of the citizens to go and correct it. And even in the case of a monarchy, that's, you know, in the case of a monarchy that goes bad, you just, you know, get rid of the king. Right? In the case of elected leaders doing the bad things, get rid of them. But I would also suggest that when we go and we look at what exactly is good and bad and what exactly is the role of government, we should bear in mind what warrants use of a sword versus what doesn't. Now going to parenthood. What happens when our parents do bad things? It's very similar to when the government does bad things, except they're closer to us and maybe actually do care for us even if they're saying the wrong thing. And it's, well, how do you deal with that? It's with respect and with gentleness. Correct them. And I've noticed the tendency of many teenagers to go and be rebellious and to start fights with their parents. And I can understand that as kind of a means of distancing themselves from their parents, but the fact of the matter is, you catch a whole lot more flies with honey than you do vinegar. except I conducted an experiment, and, well, that I don't have conclusive proof that that's actually the case. But still, the metaphor works. Is that correcting in gentleness and with patience, and then ultimately, oftentimes, biding your time and waiting until you have the opportunity to make your own decisions in your own household is a much better option than causing a huge fuss and acting like a jerk and ultimately decreasing in credibility. Now, I would say that if your parents are drug addicts, then a whole lot of this just goes down the tubes, because you can't exactly reason with a drug addict. But assuming that your parents are basically, have their stuff together, aren't drunk, aren't high, being respectful to them is a much better way of getting them to see your way if they're wrong than being defiant and horrible. And yeah, it often takes a long time, and we wish that people would listen to us immediately when we say something that seems to make a great deal of sense. And, well, I guess it provides us an opportunity to practice articulating our points of view, but then there's also the off chance that we might be the one that's wrong, the ones that are wrong. I know I've been wrong on plenty of occasions, and my own parents have been wrong on plenty of occasions, and I have a good enough relationship with them to be able to go and openly and honestly discuss things, and I would wish that on everybody else. And I would say that, at least attempting to make such an environment possible, at least making an attempt to have that kind of respectful milieu should be something that we strive to accomplish. Yeah. And some people it's more difficult to do than others, but then also being able to be a peacemaker in that sense really helps in terms of building character and dealing with other difficult people. So, many people will never learn, but you're not going to get any further with them by escalating things to the point of having an explosion than you will by being respectful. And so taking biblical advice is, in that sense, a good thing to do. The reason that I'm a libertarian is because I think that a lot of what the government assumes upon itself as a role is actually within the domain of what the family should be doing. Because the sword is not the tool for any of the jobs that it has been made to look like the tool to do. Now, that's not to say that I don't think the parents should discipline their children. I actually think that that's an important part of the parental role, and one that people don't discuss all that much because it's not a very popular, nor is it a fun topic. It's not fun to take away things from your children that you wish that you could give them with open hands. It's not fun to drag your kid kicking and screaming out of the restaurant and not let her finish her meal because she's throwing a fit, and wait until she gets home and eat something else, and sit there and pay a decently sized bill because you've stuck to your guns and aren't letting your kiddo misbehave in a public setting and be disrespectful to everybody else around. That's not easy. You want to just be able to calm your kiddo down and have a good time with them, and sometimes they don't let you do that. And you need to be able to put your foot down and say, no, that's not the way it's going to happen here. But that's very, very different than the sword. Ultimately, having the power of the sword at your disposal is something the parents do. I would say that it's not the role of the parent to be able to kill the child. And I don't know, it's interesting. One can say, yeah, you have to have the sword in order to keep people paying their taxes. Maybe because ultimately it's like, okay, if they try to arrest you and you resist arrest, you will get killed, right? Okay. Anyhow, that's a weird digression. But the point is that there's a very big difference in between the discipline that a parent gives and what a government gives. A government doesn't necessarily give it out of the same kind of parental love that the parent would give the discipline. The government can just flat out punish. Boom. 15 years in jail. Boom. You're sentenced to death by lethal injection. Boom, whatever. The government can go and do all these different things. They're harsh. They're way harsher than what a parent is. And ultimately, if the parent does the job properly and the kiddo does his job properly, then the government isn't going to need to be giving out all these harsh things, because the kiddo will have already developed his character and a sense of discipline to do the right things to begin with. But yet both of these ideas of parents and other authorities, teachers and pastors do, stem from the idea that there's some sort of order, some sort of hierarchy, that people are put in charge for a reason. And in a Christian perspective, he who wants to be great among you must become your servant. So the reason of having people in positions of authority is actually to have them be servants. And so that is why you can gladly submit to their authority, is because you know that they're actually there for your good. And using one's authority for anything other than serving, I would say, is a misuse of said authority and is wrong. But ultimately, the people that are under authority should at least at first make an attempt to rectify the situation with all gentleness. And only once those means have been exhausted should one resort to something more drastic. I mean, I could go through the entire history of the Revolutionary War and how, the country of the United States was formed. But ultimately, there was a certain process by which things escalated, right? There was a process by which certain things escalated, and that was that. So, anyhow, we've been going for nearly half an hour, and we've touched briefly on the subject of parents and government. Now, what about those who parents give authority to? Caretakers, or teachers, or tutors? Or what about when we go to church? Well, the pastor doesn't have the authority of the sword. Okay, the teacher doesn't have the authority of the sword. The teacher has the authority that the parent gives if the teacher is teaching, right? And the pastor has the authority to forgive sins or withhold forgiveness if the person is unrepentant. Notice, not to withhold forgiveness for any other reason than unrepentance. And the pastor has the authority to preside over church, to read the word and preach it, to forgive sins, by administering the sacrament of baptism, to forgive sins by administering the sacrament of the altar, by administering Holy Communion. But insofar as the pastor is acting in the capacity that he's been given by God, we submit ourselves to what the pastor says. Now, granted, that means we need to know the Bible so that we understand if the pastor is ever usurping his role, but by and large, if someone is there in a position of being your servant, you do what they say, and part of that means that is part of being a pastor means that you should be able to get your living by being a pastor, which means that obviously you pay your pastor for doing the work of God, or at least let him be able to subsist and take care of his family from it. Something of the sort. And then, of course, the pastor's job is to care for the souls of his congregation members. Okay? And so this goes back and forth to this whole idea that we'll discuss in greater detail at the table of duties. We'll discuss that at some other point, much later. Just kind of look and see what it is that you're responsible for doing in your role in life, and do that to the best of your ability. And one of those things is knowing what your role is in life and where you exist within the current hierarchical structure of society. What is your role? And then understanding who you honor and who you love and who you serve and how and so on. So you let the hierarchy at least sort of kind of guide you in terms of that, and then if you see things are wrong, A, get your stuff straightened out first. And B, if you are working within particular structure, treat people with gentleness and honor, and try to get things straightened out before escalating the situation. And if something isn't within the realm of what people should actually be able to do, then at least try to do things yourself and realize that maybe all of these things that you think should be done are a whole lot harder than they at first appear, and maybe that'll cause you to rethink your tactics, rethink your tax, rethink your ideas if you try to actually implement things as opposed to doing nothing but whining and complaining about it. Now, take responsibility for what you can take responsibility for, and believe me, you will get more responsibility if you do a good job with what you do have, and if more responsibility is what you want. Just understand, if you want to have power to be able to accomplish certain things, if you want to have legitimate authority, you must take responsibility. Because if you don't take responsibility, you are not going to be worthy of the role that you seek. That's about all I have to say on the matter now. Subject of authority is a very difficult one for me because I think that in many aspects governments overstep their authority quite a bit. And interestingly, God tells us how we should deal with it as Christians, at least, and that's that we render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. So if we understand what it is that we owe God, then that lets us have a very clear delineation as to when it's right to obey authorities versus when one must engage in civil disobedience. It's very difficult, but if government wants you to do something immoral, your parents want you to do something immoral, you can't do that. Just make sure you got your moral compass straightened out, tuned in the right direction before you go and say, well, I'm just not going to do that, or whatever. What we owe God is we are to fear, love, and trust in Him. We are not to despise preaching in His word. And we are not to curse, swear, use witchcraft, lie, or deceive by His name, right? So if we fear, love, and trust in Him above all things, then that means we are not going to expect government to do anything more than what He gives government to do. And if you want a little bit more of a look into, well, the nature of things, and I know this is a bit of a logical leap, but I think it'll make sense if you do the reading. I would recommend reading the book of Ecclesiastes. Because Solomon kind of talks about the nature of the way things are in the world, and that ultimately everything is meaningless without God. Now, of course, if you're not a Christian, I frankly don't know what to say. You don't believe, because I'm going at this from the entire perspective of a Christian, of somebody who does believe in God and does believe that God has a certain use for things. So that will color my interpretation. I only hope that it winds up being good for you, even if you don't believe. Yeah. I really want that for you. Anyhow, I thank you very much for your time. Hope you have a good rest of the weekend, and look forward to seeing you next weekend.